The world is often mistaken in what it chooses to fear. It fears the thunder, but not the suffocating stillness that precedes the storm. It fears the shouted threat, but not the chilling, protracted silence of a person who has been pushed beyond their limits. For that silence is not empty, it is dense. It is a vacuum where a heart used to be, now filled with the immense pressure of a promise, a vow made in the dark. It is the drawing of a single, deep breath before the world is changed forever. In the penthouse office of the Vance Tower, where the skyline of New York was a jagged, unforgiving heartbeat against the glass, the silence was absolute. Amelia sat before a desk that was a vast expanse of polished obsidian, a reflection of the cold gray sky outside. On the other side sat Eleanor Vance, her mother-in-law, a woman carved from ice and ambition, the matriarch and CEO of Vance Designs. And standing just behind Eleanor's shoulder, a ghost in a tailored suit, was Mark, her husband. Eleanor's voice, when it finally cut through the tension, was as smooth and sharp as a shard of glass. As you know, Amelia, the fourth quarter presents us with unique challenges. We've been analyzing our workflow, our structural efficiency, and regrettably, we have concluded that your position has become redundant. The words were corporate, sterile, a string of meaningless syllables designed to hide their brutal intent. But Amelia heard the unspoken truth. She saw where Eleanor's gaze flickered for just a fraction of a second, down towards the gentle swell of her stomach beneath her dress, where her son, their grandson, was quietly growing. The restructuring wasn't in the company, it was in the family. She was the project being canceled. She turned her eyes to Mark, pleading, searching for an ally, a husband, for the man who had whispered promises to her under starry nights. He would not meet her gaze. His eyes were fixed on some insignificant point on the expensive rug, his jaw tight, his hands buried deep in his pockets. His silence was his answer. It was his signature on her execution papers. The shock was a physical blow. It stole the air from her lungs. It wasn't the loss of a career she had poured her soul into. It was the clean, effortless way her life had been dissected and discarded by the two people she thought she could trust above all others. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stood, her movements slow and deliberate, and walked out of the office, past the silent secretary, into the elevator that descended like a stone into the heart of the city. As the doors opened to the lobby, the heavens opened with them. She walked out into a downpour, the cold rain plastering her hair to her skin, but she barely felt it. She felt only the profound, hollow ache of a double betrayal. With one hand, she clutched the strap of her purse, and with the other, she instinctively covered her belly. In a world that had just crumbled to dust around her, this tiny secret life was the only foundation she had left. Before the foundations cracked and the walls came down, the life Amelia and Mark Vance had built together was a masterpiece of modern design. On the surface, it was flawless, a structure of light and glass and ambition, perched high above the chaos of New York City. Every line was clean, every angle was perfect. It was a life chronicled in the glossy pages of architectural digests and society magazines, a testament to the golden couple poised to inherit the future of American design. But like any structure, its integrity depended entirely on the parts you couldn't see, the hidden supports, the unseen tensions. And the most critical pillar of their world, Amelia would soon discover, was hollow. Amelia herself was the architect of her own soul. She had no inheritance, no gilded surname to smooth her path. Orphaned as a child, she was raised by a system that often forgets, yet she refused to be forgotten. She built her life, brick by brick, with the mortar of sleepless nights and the sheer force of her own talent. Scholarships were her stepping stones, libraries, her sanctuaries. She didn't just see buildings, she saw the stories they told, the lives they held within their walls. For Amelia, architecture was an act of profound empathy, a way to create spaces that could shelter, inspire, and endure. She was brilliant, not in a loud or arrogant way, but with a quiet, intense light that shone through her work. When she met Mark Vance at a university guest lecture, she wasn't drawn to the famous name. She was drawn to the spark in his eyes when he talked about the timeless elegance of Louis Kahn, his frustration with the soulless glass boxes sprouting up across the city. She fell in love with a man she believed was her creative equal, a partner with whom she could draft a new world. Marrying him felt like finding the missing piece of her own blueprint, a completion of a design she didn't even know she was drafting. Mark Vance was, in every sense, a man born to a blueprint not of his own making. As the sole heir to the Vance empire, his path had been laid out for him in Carrara marble from the moment of his birth. He was handsome, charming, and possessed an easy grace that came from a lifetime of privilege. He was the public face of the company's future, the prince regent to his mother's throne. And he did love Amelia. He was genuinely captivated by her. She was a force of nature, a whirlwind of fresh ideas and raw, authentic passion that was intoxicatingly different from the calculated pleasantries of his own world. In her, he saw a chance to be more than just his father's son, more than his mother's successor. He saw a chance to be a true creator. In their early years, this vision burned brightly. They would spend nights in their sprawling penthouse studio, the city lights twinkling below, sketching designs on the same sheet of paper, their ideas flowing into one another. He championed her hiring advanced designs, proudly telling everyone she was the most innovative mind he had ever met. He was the man who held her hand at galas, beaming as she accepted awards, whispering in her ear, "We're going to change everything." His love was real, but it was a fragile thing, grown in a greenhouse. It had never been tested by the harsh winds of consequence, and it had never been forced to stand against the monolithic shadow of his mother. That shadow had a name: Eleanor Vance. To the world, Eleanor was a titan, a feminist icon who had taken her late husband's respectable firm and forged it into an international powerhouse. She was always impeccably dressed, her words precise, her gaze assessing. She moved through the world as if she owned it, and in many ways, she did. When Amelia first entered the family, she had looked upon Eleanor with awe, a future mentor she was desperate to impress. But the warmth she offered was a calculated, sterile heat, like a fireplace that is never lit. Eleanor never overtly disapproved of Amelia. She was far too sophisticated for that. Instead, her disdain was in the details. It was in the way she would introduce Amelia by referencing her scholarship, a subtle reminder of her humble origins. It was in the casual remarks at dinner parties about the importance of good breeding in both horses and people. It was in the way she would listen to Amelia's bold, new ideas for the company, nod politely, and then turn to Mark to ask his opinion, as if Amelia's words were merely a prelude to the main conversation. She saw Amelia not as a daughter-in-law, but as a risky acquisition, a variable that threatened the carefully curated brand of the Vance legacy. In Eleanor's world, love was a currency, and family was a corporation. Amelia, with her earnest heart and self-made history, simply didn't fit the balance sheet. Their life together was a beautiful illusion. They lived in a home that was less a sanctuary and more a showroom, a testament to the Vance aesthetic. Friends, who were more often clients and business associates, would sip champagne on their terrace, admiring the view and the perfect couple who presided over it. They were a team, a brand, a story the world loved to read. Amelia, lost in the happiness of building a life and a career with the man she adored, chose to ignore the warning signs. She mistook Mark's deference to his mother as filial respect, not as a deeply ingrained fear. She interpreted Eleanor's cool distance as the caution of a protective mother, not the silent appraisal of an enemy. She believed so deeply in the strength of the structure they were building that she never thought to check the integrity of its core. She believed their love was the foundation. She was wrong. The foundation was, and had always been, Eleanor's approval. And when Amelia committed the ultimate act of defiance, not by challenging a design or losing a client, but by daring to start a family on her own timeline, she inadvertently took a sledgehammer to that fragile, hollow pillar. And the whole perfect, beautiful, fragile world came crashing down. The first sign of the fracture, the initial hairline crack in the facade of their perfect life, appeared on a Tuesday evening in late spring. It began not with a tremor, but with a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. Amelia had waited all day, her heart a fluttering bird against her ribs. She had arranged the evidence of their new future on the large drafting table in their studio, not a clinical ultrasound photo, but a small, perfect pair of white baby shoes placed gently on top of a newly drawn blueprint. It was a simple, elegant design for a nursery, with notes in her own handwriting about a ceiling painted with constellations and a window seat for telling stories. When Mark came home, she led him to the studio, her hand in his. For a moment, he just stared, his mind processing the image, and then a slow, radiant smile spread across his face, a smile so genuine it seemed to light up the entire room. He lifted her off the ground, spinning her around as the city lights blurred into streaks of gold behind them. "A nursery?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Amelia, are you serious?" That night, there was no talk of business, no mention of deadlines or clients. There was only the quiet, sacred joy of two people contemplating a shared future, a new life they had created together. He held her close, his hand resting on her stomach, and they talked for hours about names and schools, and whether the baby would inherit his eyes or her talent for drawing. In that moment, suspended in the warm glow of their love, they were invincible. The foundation felt like solid rock. The invincibility lasted until Sunday dinner. It was a weekly ritual, held at Eleanor's cavernous, art-filled apartment on Park Avenue, a place so immaculately curated it felt more like a museum than a home. Mark, still beaming, announced the news over the first course, his voice full of a pride that Amelia found deeply endearing. He raised his glass of water in a toast to her, to them, to their future. Amelia watched her mother-in-law. Eleanor did not smile. She did not frown. Her expression remained perfectly, unnervingly neutral. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, placed the glass back on the coaster with a silent click, and then folded her hands on the table. "I see," she said, her voice a flat, polished surface. "And have you considered the timing?" It was not a question, it was a judgment. Mark's smile faltered. "The timing is perfect, Mom. We're happy." Eleanor's eyes shifted to Amelia, her gaze as cool and analytical as if she were inspecting a flawed blueprint. "The Nakatomi Tower contract is in its most critical phase, Amelia. You are the lead architect. Your focus is, shall we say, essential to its success. A pregnancy is a significant biological commitment. It will have consequences on your availability, your energy." Amelia felt a chill creep over her skin. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my responsibilities, Eleanor. Women do it all the time." Eleanor offered a thin, dismissive smile. "Some women are content to manage. Vance women, and those who marry into this family, are expected to conquer. This is an inconvenient complication." The rest of the dinner was a blur of polite, meaningless conversation, but the damage was done. Eleanor had not raised her voice, but she had detonated a bomb of doubt in the center of their joy, and the fallout was just beginning to spread. The private conversations started the next day. Amelia didn't hear them, but she felt their aftershocks. Mark would come home late from the office, claiming he and his mother were strategizing, and he would carry the scent of Eleanor's icy logic with him. The words he used began to change. Suddenly, their baby was no longer a source of excitement, but a variable. Their future was no longer a dream, but a 5-year plan that was now disrupted. One evening, Amelia found him staring at the nursery blueprint. "Maybe we should hold off on this," he said, not looking at her. "It's a bit premature. We need to think about the optics." The word hung in the air between them, ugly and foreign. It was his mother's word. "Optics? Mark, this is our child, not a press release." He sighed, a sound of profound weariness that scraped against her heart. "You're being emotional, Amelia. This is bigger than us. It's about the company, the legacy. My mother is just worried that people might think you planned this to secure your position." The accusation was so vile, so far from the truth of their love, that Amelia couldn't even form a response. He was no longer speaking as her husband. He was speaking as Eleanor Vance's son. The crack had become a fissure. It widened with each passing day. He started sleeping in the guest room, claiming his late nights were disturbing her rest. but the space he put between their bodies was nothing compared to the chasm growing between their minds. He stopped asking about her doctor's appointments. He stopped touching her stomach. The shared joy that had once lit up their home was extinguished, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. The masterpiece of their life was beginning to look like a ruin, and Amelia was wandering through it alone, haunted by the ghost of the man she had married, terrified that the foundation she had trusted was nothing more than sand. The campaign to erase Amelia from Vance Designs was not a frontal assault, but a quiet, insidious siege. It began subtly, a series of small, almost imperceptible shifts in the corporate landscape. A meeting she would normally lead was rescheduled without her knowledge. An email chain discussing a critical design flaw on the Nakatomi project would mysteriously omit her name. At first, she dismissed these as administrative errors, the inevitable oversights in a company of that size. But the errors became a pattern, and the pattern began to form the unmistakable outlines of a conspiracy. The office, once a canvas for her creativity, began to feel like hostile territory. The open, collaborative atmosphere she had championed now felt laced with whispers and sideways glances. She was an architect who could read the hidden language of a space, and she could feel the geometry of her own world being deliberately, cruelly altered. The primary instrument of this alteration was a senior designer named Clara. Clara was ambitious, with a sharp, angular beauty and an even sharper mind. She had always been a rival, but a professional one. Now, she was something else entirely. Eleanor began to publicly champion Clara, praising her unencumbered dedication and her singular focus. It started with the Nakatomi project. Amelia's core design concept remained, but Clara was assigned to oversee its implementation. In reality, Clara began to dismantle Amelia's work, piece by piece, replacing her innovative, human-centric touches with colder, more cost-effective, but less soulful alternatives. In a team meeting, Amelia would watch as Clara presented a slide deck showcasing new directions for the tower's facade, directions that were a direct repudiation of Amelia's original vision. And when Amelia tried to defend her choices, Eleanor would cut her off with a placid smile. "Thank you for the input, Amelia. But Clara has the data to back this up. We must be driven by pragmatism now, not just passion." It was a public humiliation, a coronation of her replacement while she was still in the room. Even more painful was watching the budding partnership between Clara and Mark. They were suddenly a team, huddled together over blueprints, their heads close. He laughed at her jokes. He praised her fresh perspective. To Amelia, it felt like watching him have an affair, not with another woman, but with the life that was being stolen from her. Her isolation was methodical, a masterclass in psychological warfare. She became a ghost, haunting the halls of her own career. She would walk past a glass-walled conference room to see her own team. The team she had personally mentored, engaged in a vibrant brainstorming session with Eleanor and Clara. The door was closed. They would see her, and for a moment, their hands would freeze over their notepads before they would force themselves to look away, back to the whiteboard, back to their new leader. It was a clear, brutal message. You are no longer one of us. Mark became the chief architect of this isolation. He was her husband, the one person who should have been her refuge, but he had become her gatekeeper, blocking her from the truth. When she confronted him about the secret meeting, he refused to meet her eyes, adjusting his tie in the reflection of their bedroom window. It was a last-minute logistics huddle. "Amelia, Mom didn't want to stress you out. You need to be resting." The lie was so blatant, so insulting in its assumption of her fragility, that it left her breathless. He was using her pregnancy, the very thing that was being used to oust her, as an excuse for his own cowardice. He wasn't protecting her. He was hiding from her, and hiding her from the world he had chosen over her. The breaking point, the moment the siege ended and the final, brutal attack began, came with a summons. Not a meeting invitation on her calendar, but a curt call from Eleanor's personal assistant. "Mrs. Vance would like to see you in her office. Now." There was no mention of an agenda. There didn't need to be. Amelia knew. Every step she took down the long, silent hallway towards the penthouse office felt like a walk towards a guillotine. The air grew colder, thinner. When she entered, the scene was exactly as she had pictured it in her nightmares. Eleanor, a queen upon her throne, sat behind her vast obsidian desk, and Mark, her Mark, stood behind his mother's chair, a silent sentinel, his face a mask of strained neutrality. He was a stranger. This was the moment she realized, with chilling certainty, that the man she had married was gone. Perhaps he had never truly existed at all. And as Eleanor began to speak those sterile, rehearsed words about restructuring and redundancy, Amelia's mind detached. She heard the sounds, but they were just noise. Instead, she saw a rapid, painful montage of the past few weeks. Clara's triumphant smile, the closed-door meetings, the averted eyes of her colleagues, the cold space in her bed, and Mark's endless, pathetic excuses. It all clicked into place. This wasn't a firing. It was an execution, planned for weeks, and her husband had stood by and watched them build the scaffold. She looked at him one last time, a final, desperate plea. He just stared at the rug, a coward to the very end. That silence, that final, unforgivable silence, was the only sound she heard as she walked away from her career, her family, and the smoldering ruins of her life. The campaign to erase Amelia from Vance Designs was not a frontal assault, but a quiet, insidious siege. It began subtly, a series of small, almost imperceptible shifts in the corporate landscape. A meeting she would normally lead was rescheduled without her knowledge. An email chain discussing a critical design flaw on the Nakatomi project would mysteriously omit her name. At first, she dismissed these as administrative errors, the inevitable oversights in a company of that size. But the errors became a pattern, and the pattern began to form the unmistakable outlines of a conspiracy. The office, once a canvas for her creativity, began to feel like hostile territory. The open, collaborative atmosphere she had championed now felt laced with whispers and sideways glances. She was an architect who could read the hidden language of a space, and she could feel the geometry of her own world being deliberately, cruelly altered. The primary instrument of this alteration was a senior designer named Clara. Clara was ambitious, with a sharp, angular beauty and an even sharper mind. She had always been a rival, but a professional one. Now, she was something else entirely. Eleanor began to publicly champion Clara, praising her unencumbered dedication and her singular focus. It started with the Nakatomi project. Amelia's core design concept remained, but Clara was assigned to oversee its implementation. In reality, Clara began to dismantle Amelia's work, piece by piece, replacing her innovative, human-centric touches with colder, more cost-effective, but less soulful alternatives. In a team meeting, Amelia would watch as Clara presented a slide deck showcasing new directions for the tower's facade, directions that were a direct repudiation of Amelia's original vision. And when Amelia tried to defend her choices, Eleanor would cut her off with a placid smile. "Thank you for the input, Amelia. But Clara has the data to back this up. We must be driven by pragmatism now, not just passion." It was a public humiliation, a coronation of her replacement while she was still in the room. Even more painful was watching the budding partnership between Clara and Mark. They were suddenly a team, huddled together over blueprints, their heads close. He laughed at her jokes. He praised her fresh perspective. To Amelia, it felt like watching him have an affair, not with another woman, but with the life that was being stolen from her. Her isolation was methodical, a masterclass in psychological warfare. She became a ghost, haunting the halls of her own career. She would walk past a glass-walled conference room to see her own team, the team she had personally mentored, engaged in a vibrant brainstorming session with Eleanor and Clara. The door was closed. They would see her, and for a moment, their hands would freeze over their notepads before they would force themselves to look away, back to the whiteboard, back to their new leader. It was a clear, brutal message. You are no longer one of us. Mark became the chief architect of this isolation. He was her husband, the one person who should have been her refuge, but he had become her gatekeeper, blocking her from the truth. When she confronted him about the secret meeting, he refused to meet her eyes, adjusting his tie in the reflection of their bedroom window. It was a last-minute logistics huddle, Amelia. Mom didn't want to stress you out. You need to be resting. The lie was so blatant, so insulting in its assumption of her fragility, that it left her breathless. He was using her pregnancy, the very thing that was being used to oust her, as an excuse for his own cowardice. He wasn't protecting her. He was hiding from her, and hiding her from the world he had chosen over her. The breaking point, the moment the siege ended and the final, brutal attack began, came with a summons. Not a meeting invitation on her calendar, but a curt call from Eleanor's personal assistant, Mrs. Vance would like to see you in her office. Now, there was no mention of an agenda. There didn't need to be. Amelia knew. Every step she took down the long, silent hallway towards the penthouse office felt like a walk towards a guillotine. The air grew colder, thinner. When she entered, the scene was exactly as she had pictured it in her nightmares. Eleanor, a queen upon her throne, sat behind her vast obsidian desk. And Mark, her Mark, stood behind his mother's chair, a silent sentinel, his face a mask of strained neutrality. He was a stranger. This was the moment she realized, with chilling certainty, that the man she had married was gone. Perhaps he had never truly existed at all. And as Eleanor began to speak those sterile, rehearsed words about restructuring and redundancy, Amelia's mind detached. She heard the sounds, but they were just noise. Instead, she saw a rapid, painful montage of the past few weeks. Clara's triumphant smile, the closed-door meetings, the averted eyes of her colleagues, the cold space in her bed, and Mark's endless, pathetic excuses. It all clicked into place. This wasn't a firing, it was an execution, planned for weeks, and her husband had stood by and watched them build the scaffold. She looked at him one last time, a final, desperate plea. He just stared at the rug, a coward to the very end. That silence, that final, unforgivable silence, was the only sound she heard as she walked away from her career, her family, and the smoldering ruins of her life. The final ties to her old life were severed not with a conversation, but with the crisp, impersonal rustle of paper. A week after she walked out of Vance Tower, a courier delivered a thick manila envelope to the temporary hotel room she was staying in. Inside, there were no letters, no apologies, no explanations. There were only legal documents, filled with cold, sterile jargon that officially declared her marriage to Mark Vance to be irretrievably broken. He had filed for divorce. He had not called. He had not seen her. He had simply outsourced the final, fatal blow to his lawyers. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He had not only allowed her to be fired, he had disposed of their entire life together with the clinical efficiency of a corporate merger gone wrong. The signature at the bottom of the page, the familiar, elegant scrawl she had once loved, now looked like a scar. Returning to the penthouse to pack was the hardest thing she had ever done. The space, which she had once co-designed as a monument to their shared future, now felt like a mausoleum. Every object was a ghost. The photograph on the mantelpiece of them laughing on a beach in Italy, the thick art books they had collected, the half-finished sculpture in her studio. She moved through the rooms with a numb, methodical purpose, packing only what was truly hers: her clothes, her books, her personal drafting tools. She found the nursery blueprint, rolled it up, and tied it with a simple ribbon. It was not a sad memory anymore. It was a promise. When she was done, she walked into the kitchen, a marvel of minimalist design with a vast marble island where they had once cooked and laughed. She slipped her wedding ring from her finger, the heavy platinum suddenly feeling like a shackle. She placed it squarely in the center of the cold, white stone, a final, silent statement. Then she walked out and closed the door, not just on an apartment, but on the woman she used to be. Her new life was a world away, on the third floor of a walk-up brownstone in a neighborhood that didn't glitter. There were no doormen, no sweeping views, just a window that looked out onto a brick wall and the constant chaotic symphony of the city. The sheer contrast was a daily shock to her system. Her former life had been a world of silent elevators, curated art, and whispered pleasantries. This new life was a world of creaking floorboards, the smell of her neighbors cooking in the hallway, and the wail of sirens in the night. The emptiness of her days was a physical presence. With no job to go to, no husband to come home to, the hours stretched into an abyss of anxiety. She would spend her time walking through parks, sitting in cafes just to be around the comforting noise of strangers, her hand always resting on her growing belly. She would check her dwindling bank account with a knot of fear in her stomach. Some nights, she would wake up in a cold sweat, the loneliness so profound it felt like she was suffocating. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. This was rock bottom, a place with no foundation, no walls, just a long, terrifying drop. The descent ended the way it had to, in fire and pain. When her water broke in the middle of the night, she called a car service, her bag already packed by the door. She walked into the hospital alone. The hours that followed were a primal blur of exhaustion and agony. The physical pain was immense, but it was a clean pain, a purposeful one. It was a strange and welcome contrast to the messy, complicated emotional pain that had been her constant companion for months. In that sterile, white room, surrounded by the rhythmic beeping of machines, there was no past, no betrayal, only the monumental, all-consuming task of bringing a new life into the world. And as the sun began to cast a pale, gray light over the city, her son was born with a loud, defiant cry. They placed him in her arms, a tiny, warm, perfect being, and the world shifted on its axis. She named him Leo. As she looked into his impossibly new eyes, a profound and powerful transformation took place within her. The grief that had been a suffocating fog began to crystallize. The despair that had been an anchor dragging her down began to harden into something else entirely. Steel. In her son's face, she did not see a reminder of what she had lost. She did not see Mark. She did not see the Vances. She saw a blank page. She saw the future. She saw a reason. All the pain, all the humiliation, all the betrayal of the past months did not vanish, but it was reforged. It was no longer a weapon used against her. It was a weapon she was now learning to wield. The hollow ache of loneliness was filled with a fierce, protective love that was more powerful than any architect's ambition. In the quiet of that hospital room, holding her sleeping son against her chest, Amelia Reed made a silent vow. She would not just survive, she would not just build a life for them, she would build an empire. She would construct a fortress of success so high and so impenetrable that the Vances, with all their inherited power and casual cruelty, would one day look up and see nothing but her shadow. The desire for revenge was born in that moment, not in a flash of hot rage, but in the cold, calm, patient certainty of a mother who had nothing left to lose and a whole new world to build. The first year of Leo's life was a blur of contrary sensations. It was the profound exhaustion of sleepless nights and the electrifying jolt of a baby's first smile. It was the crushing weight of financial anxiety and the immeasurable lightness of a tiny hand wrapped around her finger. For months, Amelia's world shrank to the four walls of her small apartment, her schedule dictated by feeding times and nap schedules. But in the quiet hours of the night, while her son slept soundly on her chest, the architect within her began to stir. Her grief had been processed, her rage had been banked, and what remained was a cold, clear sense of purpose. She would not be a victim. She would not be a footnote in the Vance family history. She would be the author of her own story. One night, at her small kitchen table, with the city humming a lullaby outside her window, she opened a fresh sketchbook. She didn't draw a building. She drew a logo, a single, elegant wing entwined with a rising flame, and beneath it, she wrote two words: Phoenix Designs. It was more than a name. It was a mission statement. It was a promise to herself and to her son that they would rise from the ashes of her old life, not just restored, but reborn, stronger and more brilliant than before. Starting from zero was a humbling and brutal education. The woman who had once managed billion-dollar skyscraper projects now found herself pitching for jobs that Vance Designs wouldn't even consider for an intern. Her office was her kitchen table, littered with baby toys and coffee cups. Her state-of-the-art computer had been replaced by a refurbished laptop. Her clients were not international corporations, but small, local business owners with big dreams and small budgets. Her first project was a cramped coffee shop whose owner wanted to create a sense of community in a space no bigger than a subway car. Her second was a young family's apartment renovation, where every design choice was dictated by a shoestring budget. Amelia poured every ounce of her talent and soul into these small projects. She found a new kind of joy in them, an intimacy and a sense of real-world impact that had often been missing in the rarefied air of corporate architecture. She didn't just design spaces, she solved problems. She listened. She created a coffee shop that became the neighborhood's living room. She turned a cramped apartment into a light-filled, functional family home. Word of her talent, her empathy, and her fierce work ethic began to spread quietly through the city's boroughs. She was building a reputation, one small, perfect project at a time, working late into the night after Leo was asleep, fueled by coffee and a relentless, burning drive. The past, however, had not entirely forgotten her. One afternoon, as she sat on a park bench watching Leo try to take his first steps, a familiar voice called her name. It was Mr. Harrison, the former head accountant of Vance Designs. He was older, grayer, but his eyes held the same quiet intelligence and integrity she remembered. He told her he had seen a small feature on her coffee shop design in a local magazine and had been trying to find her ever since. He was not there out of pity. He was there out of a deep and abiding respect and an equally deep and abiding disgust for what had been done to her. "I worked for the Vance family for 40 years, Amelia," he said, his voice low and steady. "I watched Eleanor turn her husband's respectable firm into an empire. But I also watched her ambition curdle into something ugly. What she did to you, it wasn't business. It was a betrayal of everything this industry is supposed to be about. It was the last straw for me." He had retired shortly after she was fired, unable to stomach the hypocrisy any longer. In that moment, Amelia found the one thing she hadn't realized she was missing: an ally. Mr. Harrison became her secret mentor, her silent partner. He refused any offer of payment, stating that his reward was seeing true talent get its due. They would meet in quiet cafes, their conversations a masterclass in business strategy. He looked over her rudimentary finances and taught her how to build a robust business plan. He showed her how to structure her contracts to protect herself, how to negotiate with suppliers, how to make every dollar of her meager capital work like 10. But his most valuable contributions were his insights into the weaknesses of his former employer. "Eleanor has become arrogant," he explained over coffee one day. "She believes her own press. She builds monuments to corporate vanity, but she's forgotten how to design for actual people. She's slow to adapt to new technology and sustainable materials. She sees them as trends, not the future. That is her weakness. That is where you will win." He was more than a mentor. He was a validation. He was a voice from her past that confirmed she was not the failure the Vances had tried to make her. He saw her not as a discarded woman, but as a future titan of the industry. His belief in her reignited her belief in herself. With his wisdom guiding her and her own talent as her engine, Phoenix Designs began its ascent. The first brick had been laid, not on the shifting sands of a powerful family's approval, but on the bedrock of her own resilience and the quiet support of a good man. This foundation was hers, and it was unbreakable. The small, tentative steps of Phoenix Designs soon became a confident, powerful stride. The years that followed its inception were a masterclass in relentless growth, a testament to the fact that an empire built on passion and principle can rise faster and stronger than one built on pedigree alone. The kitchen table was replaced by a small, rented office, which was then replaced by a full floor in a modern, light-filled building in Soho. The name Amelia Reed, once unknown, began to be spoken with a mixture of curiosity and reverence in the circles that mattered. She was no longer a survivor. She was a force, and her ascent was a quiet, steady earthquake, shaking the foundations of the old guard. The success of Phoenix Designs was rooted in a philosophy that was a direct rebellion against everything Vance Designs stood for. While Eleanor Vance was still building cold, opulent monuments to wealth, designed to intimidate and impress, Amelia was creating living, breathing spaces designed to nurture and inspire. Her company became the vanguard of a new movement in architecture. Sustainability was not a buzzword. It was the core of every project, using reclaimed wood, passive solar design, and green roofs that turned urban landscapes into ecosystems. Technology was woven into the very fabric of her creations, with smart systems that learned from their inhabitants and virtual reality models that allowed clients to walk through their homes before a single brick was laid. Most importantly, her designs were human. She obsessed over how light would fall in a room at dawn, how a space would encourage collaboration in an office, how a home could be a true sanctuary from the noise of the world. She was building the future, while Vance Designs was still polishing the past. Her portfolio became a collection of the city's most talked-about new projects. First came the Evergreen Hotel, a boutique establishment in the meatpacking district that became an icon of sustainable luxury. Its living walls and rainwater harvesting system earned her environmental accolades, while its stunning design landed it on the cover of every major travel and architecture magazine. Then came the headquarters for Ether, a booming tech startup. The commission was a major coup, a signal that the new titans of industry were choosing her vision over the established names. She created a campus that was a playground of innovation and collaboration, a physical manifestation of the company's forward-thinking ethos. And in between these high-profile jobs, she took on a pro bono project, redesigning a dilapidated public library in the very neighborhood she had first moved to after her divorce. The project earned her no money, but it solidified her reputation as an architect with a conscience, a builder of communities, not just condos. Amelia understood that a company's soul is its people. She began to hire, seeking out the brightest young minds, the passionate nonconformists who, like her, had been overlooked by the stuffy, hierarchical firms. She built a team based on mutual respect, not fear. Ideas were valued based on their merit, not the seniority of the person who spoke them. Her office was a vibrant, chaotic hub of creativity, a stark contrast to the tomb-like silence of Vance Designs, where everyone was terrified of displeasing Eleanor. She mentored her staff, championed their growth, and celebrated their successes as her own. In doing so, she forged something more powerful than a workforce, a loyal, dedicated family who would walk through fire for her and for the vision of Phoenix Designs. Throughout this meteoric rise, Amelia Reed remained an enigma. She gave interviews, but she was intensely private, a master of deflecting personal questions and steering the conversation back to her work. The media knew she was a single mother, a self-made woman, but her history before Phoenix Designs was a carefully guarded blank slate. She had legally reverted to her mother's maiden name, Reed, and had built a formidable wall between her present and her past. The name Vance was never spoken. It was a strategic silence. She knew that to the Vances, Amelia Reed was likely an insignificant, if annoyingly successful, competitor. They had no idea that the ghost they had created was now commanding an army, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her son, Leo, was the quiet center of her new universe. He was the reason for the long nights and the fierce ambition. She made sure that her role as CEO never overshadowed her role as a mother. She would leave boardrooms to make it to his school plays. She would spread blueprints on the living room floor at home, and a 5-year-old Leo would sit beside her with his Legos, proudly announcing that he was building a tower even taller than Mommy's. These were the moments that fueled her. He was not a reminder of Mark's betrayal. He was the living embodiment of her own strength and resilience. One evening, she stood on a stage, accepting the industry's most prestigious award for the Ether campus design. She was poised, gracious, and powerful. As she smiled for the cameras, she thought of the last time she had stood in a room full of powerful people, being cast out and humiliated. She thought of Eleanor and Mark, who would undoubtedly see her picture in the news the next day. A cold, calm certainty settled over her. The empire was built. The foundations were secure. The time for building was almost over. The time for retribution was about to begin. While Phoenix Designs ascended on the currents of innovation and goodwill, the Vance empire began its slow, majestic, and entirely predictable decline. It was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual erosion, like a great stone monument worn down by the relentless winds of change. From her vantage point, Amelia watched the decay with the cool, detached eye of an architect, examining a condemned building, noting every crack in the foundation, every stress fracture in the facade. The intelligence for this analysis came to her through the quiet, steady channel of Mr. Harrison, who had become her most valuable and discreet asset. The first major tremor, the one that signaled a deep, structural instability, was the loss of the Stanton Museum of Art account. The Stantons were old money, a dynasty that had been patrons of Vance Designs since Amelia's father-in-law was a young man. The renovation of their museum's main wing was considered a legacy project, a guaranteed win for the Vance brand. They were so confident, in fact, that they didn't truly compete. They presented. Eleanor and Mark unveiled a design that was classic Vance, grandiose, imposing, a monument to the wealth of the donors rather than the experience of the public. It was a design from another era. In parallel, the museum board had invited a proposal from the city's most talked-about new firm. Amelia presented the Phoenix Designs concept herself. It was a radical reimagining of the space, using natural light, interactive digital displays, and sustainable materials to create an accessible, inviting experience for a new generation of museum goers. The choice was unanimous. The board chose the future over the past. They chose Phoenix Designs. The loss sent shockwaves through the industry, but inside Vance Tower, it triggered a catastrophic level of denial. Mr. Harrison's old contacts painted a vivid picture for Amelia. Eleanor, in an emergency board meeting, had not been contrite or analytical. She had been furious. She delivered a blistering tirade against the Instagram-fueled whims of modern culture and the childish gimmickry of her competitors. She blamed the client for their lack of taste. She blamed the media for celebrating novelty over substance. She blamed everyone but herself. Her response was not to adapt, but to double down on the very principles that were causing her company to fail. She poured more money into marketing their brand of timeless, untouchable luxury, failing to realize that the world no longer wanted to be kept at a distance by the things it admired. It wanted to engage, to participate, to feel a connection. Mark, now executive vice president, was equally lost, though his incompetence manifested differently. He was a man of surfaces, and he believed the company's problems could be solved with a surface-level fix. He spent a fortune on a glossy new website and a cringe-worthy social media campaign that tried to make the stuffy Vance brand seem relatable. He was busy rearranging the furniture, while the foundations rotted away beneath him. He lacked the vision to see the fundamental decay and the courage to challenge his mother's disastrous course. The talent, the real creative lifeblood of the company, began to hemorrhage. The brightest young architects, suffocated by Eleanor's rigid dogma and frustrated by the lack of innovation, left in a steady stream, many of them sending their resumes directly to Phoenix Designs. During their discreet monthly meetings, Mr. Harrison would lay out the raw data of the decline before Amelia. He brought her leaked financial reports, balance sheets that were carefully hidden from public view. "Here," he said, pointing a finger at a dizzying number. "This is the debt from the Dubai resort, a vanity project from start to finish. The occupancy rates are a disaster, but the loan payments are very, very real. They are bleeding cash every single month just to keep it afloat." He showed her their declining profit margins, their shrinking market share. "They are a ship taking on water, Amelia, and the captain is convinced the sea is wrong." Amelia would listen to these reports with an unnerving calm. There was no flicker of triumph in her eyes, no gloating smile. She processed the information with the cold precision of a military strategist. The numbers on the page were not just numbers to her, they were vulnerabilities. The Dubai debt was a weakness in the supply line. The talent drain was a collapse in morale. Eleanor's pride was a fatal flaw in the enemy commander. She began to see the path forward with absolute clarity. Her initial, youthful ideas of revenge had been about triumphing over the Vances, about building something bigger and better to prove them wrong. She had done that, but now, she saw the endgame was something far more elegant, far more complete. It wasn't about simply winning, it was about acquisition. One evening, after a particularly damning report from Mr. Harrison, she stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her office, the city lights spreading out before her like a web of jewels. She looked across the skyline to where Vance Tower stood, its once intimidating silhouette now looking fragile, brittle. A profound realization settled over her. She didn't have to tear that building down. Eleanor and Mark were doing it for her. They were hollowing it out from the inside, leaving behind nothing but a beautiful, empty shell. And soon, all she would have to do was walk in, pick up the deed from the rubble, and write her own name on it. The moment Amelia had been waiting for, the critical strategic opening, did not arrive with a roar, but with a quiet announcement in the financial press. It was a single, discreet article buried in the business section. Vance Designs, the venerable architecture firm, announces plans for an initial public offering. To the average reader, it was a dry piece of corporate news. To Amelia, it was a confession. It was the loudest, clearest signal of profound desperation, a white flag of surrender disguised as a bold move for expansion. An IPO was not a sign of strength. It was a sign that the company was hemorrhaging cash so badly that Eleanor Vance was willing to commit the one act Amelia never thought her pride would allow. She was selling off pieces of her kingdom to outsiders to stay afloat. That evening, in the quiet of her home office, long after Leo was asleep, she met with Mr. Harrison. The newspaper lay on the desk between them. "It's a Hail Mary pass," Mr. Harrison said, his voice a low, analytical hum. "The Dubai project is an anchor, and their domestic contracts are shrinking. They need a massive infusion of capital to service their debt, and the banks have clearly turned them off. By going public, she's opening the gates. She thinks she'll be flooded with anonymous investors, each with a tiny, insignificant stake, while she retains control." Amelia looked at her old friend and mentor, her expression calm and unreadable. "She's inviting the Trojan horse inside her walls," she said, her voice soft but laced with steel. "She is so blinded by her own arrogance that she cannot imagine a world where a single, unified force would be moving against her. She will be looking for an army, but we will be a ghost." The plan they solidified that night was audacious in its scope and elegant in its simplicity. They would not merely invest, they would conquer. The objective was clear: to acquire a controlling interest of 1% of the company's shares. To do so in the open was impossible. The name Amelia Reed or Phoenix Designs appearing as a major buyer would set off every alarm bell in Vance Tower. Secrecy was their most critical weapon. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Harrison, with the precision of a master watchmaker, constructed a labyrinthine network of shell corporations and investment funds. They had bland, forgettable names: North Star Holdings, Cedar Ridge Capital, Ironwood Trust entities registered in different states, each with its own separate broker, each a single, innocuous thread in a vast, invisible web. Amelia, in turn, liquidated stock options and set up a series of transfers, moving the immense profits from Phoenix Designs into the accounts of these phantom companies. The irony was exquisite. The very empire she had built from the ashes of her destruction was now providing the arsenal for her final victory. The Evergreen Hotel, the Ether Campus, the library built for the community, every success, every award, every testament to her superior vision was converted into the capital that would be used to buy the company that had cast her out. On the day of the IPO, Eleanor and Mark Vance rang the opening bell at the stock exchange. They were all smiles for the cameras, projecting an image of confidence and legacy renewed. They watched the ticker, seeing a healthy, if not spectacular, interest in their stock. They saw a dozen different investment firms buying small blocks of shares. They saw market chatter about a legacy brand re-entering the spotlight. They saw exactly what Mr. Harrison wanted them to see. They had no idea that many of those disparate buyers were all puppets, their strings being pulled by a single, unseen hand. The Vances celebrated that night, drinking champagne and toasting to their own genius. They had saved their company. They had secured their legacy. Meanwhile, in her quiet office across town, Amelia and Mr. Harrison watched a different screen. It was a private, encrypted spreadsheet that aggregated the purchases from all their shell corporations in real time. The first day, they secured 3%. By the end of the first week, 8%. The process was a slow, methodical constriction. They bought on dips. They bought in small, irregular blocks to avoid detection. They were patient, disciplined, and relentless. The months ticked by. Phoenix Designs continued to thrive, winning a major contract for a new concert hall that put Amelia on the cover of a major magazine once again. This served as the perfect distraction. To the Vances, Amelia Reed was a rival to be watched, but she was a public figure, her moves chronicled in the press. The real threat was a shadow, and they had no idea it was her shadow. As the company's financial situation failed to improve, more institutional investors began to sell off their shares in disappointment. And every time they sold, one of Mr. Harrison's quiet, anonymous funds was there to buy, steadily, silently absorbing the power and control that was slipping through Eleanor's fingers. One rainy afternoon, nearly a year after the IPO, Mr. Harrison walked into Amelia's office and placed a tablet on her desk. He didn't say a word. He just pointed to a single cell on the spreadsheet. It was a complex document, but the final number glowed with an almost holy light. 1.02%. It was done. They had control. Amelia stared at the number, and for the first time, she allowed herself a small, slow smile. It was not a smile of glee or of malice. It was the quiet, satisfied smile of an architect who has just reviewed the final blueprint of her masterpiece and found it to be flawless. The weapon was loaded and aimed. All that remained was to choose the moment to pull the trigger. She turned to her desk calendar and drew a neat, firm circle around the date of the Vance Designs annual shareholder meeting. The countdown had begun. The Vance Designs annual shareholder meeting was held in the company's main boardroom, a chamber that felt more like a stateroom from a bygone era. The walls were paneled in dark, solemn mahogany, and heavy velvet curtains blocked out the city, creating a hermetically sealed world of old money and even older traditions. The air was thick with the scent of leather polish and the palpable tension of unhappy investors. These were not the friendly associates and family friends who had once rubber-stamped Eleanor's decisions. These were shareholders, and they were losing money. They sat around the long, polished table, with grim expressions, their pens tapping impatiently on their leather-bound portfolios. The company's stock had been in a slow, steady decline for months, and they had come for answers, not excuses. At the head of the table, Eleanor Vance was a study in controlled denial. She stood at the lectern, radiating an icy confidence that felt more brittle than ever before. Her speech was a masterpiece of corporate obfuscation, filled with phrases like leveraging our heritage brand, weathering macroeconomic headwinds, and long-term value propositions. She spoke of the company's legacy, as if it were an asset that could magically offset a disastrous balance sheet. It was a performance, and her audience was not impressed. Mark followed her, his presentation slick with meaningless charts and buzzwords about a synergistic digital-first strategy. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who has never had to face a true consequence in his life. The shareholders were unmoved. Their questions were sharp and pointed, concerning declining revenues, lost contracts, and the mass exodus of top design talent. For the first time in their lives, Eleanor and Mark were on the back foot, in their own throne room, and the unease was visible. The agenda moved forward, grinding through the formalities of the previous fiscal year. Finally, they arrived at the last item, the re-election of the board of directors, a motion to reaffirm Eleanor's position as CEO and chairman. It was supposed to be a routine vote. But as the corporate secretary began to speak, a calm, clear voice cut through the room. Mr. Chairman, I believe there is a new motion to be brought to the floor before that vote. All heads turned. A man in a simple dark suit stood near the back of the room. He was not one of the familiar board members. It was Mr. Chen, Amelia's lawyer. He adjusted his glasses and continued, his voice devoid of any drama, which only made his words more shocking. On behalf of my client, North Star Holdings, and its associated funds, which collectively represent a controlling interest of 51% of this company's shares, I hereby table a motion of no confidence in the current Chief Executive Officer, Eleanor Vance, and propose her immediate removal from the board. The room erupted. A wave of gasps and shocked whispers swept through the investors. Controlling interest? 51%? It was impossible. Eleanor's face, which had been a mask of strained composure, contorted into a snarl of pure disbelief and rage. This was her company, her kingdom. The idea that someone, some anonymous fund, had secretly bought a majority stake from under her nose was not just an attack. It was an insult to her very intelligence. She gripped the sides of the lectern, her knuckles white. "This is absurd," she spat, her voice losing its polished veneer and becoming sharp and raw. "North Star Holdings? I've never heard of them. Who is your client? Who dares to bring this charade into my boardroom? Show yourself." Her demand hung in the air, a challenge thrown down into the sudden shocked silence, and in answer, the great mahogany doors at the far end of the room swung inward, slowly and silently. Every person in the room turned to look. A figure stood silhouetted against the bright light of the hallway. It was a woman, her form poised and confident. She began to walk towards them, her steps measured and deliberate. The only sound in the vast room was the sharp, rhythmic click of her heels on the marble floor, a sound like a clock ticking down to a final, inescapable judgment. She was dressed in a tailored suit of midnight blue, a stark, modern contrast to the room's fusty grandeur. She was not a ghost from the past. She was the future, and she had come to claim her space. As she stepped fully into the light of the boardroom, a wave of recognition rippled through the room, but it crashed with the force of a tsunami upon the two people at the head of the table. Mark's jaw went slack, a look of utter, uncomprehending bewilderment on his face. His mind simply refused to process the reality before him. This was Amelia. But it was not the Amelia he had known, not the gentle, heartbroken girl he had so easily discarded. This was a queen, an empress, her expression calm, her gaze unwavering. For Eleanor, the shock was followed by a flash of pure, venomous hatred, and then the dawning, soul-crushing horror of complete understanding. In that instant, she saw it all: the lost clients, the financial decline, the quiet acquisition of her company's soul. It had all been leading to this. To her, Amelia stopped at the side of the table, her presence commanding the absolute attention of everyone present. She turned her cool, steady gaze directly to Eleanor. Her voice when she spoke was quiet, yet it carried the weight of an army. "You were asking for the owner of North Star Holdings," she said, her words precise and devastating. "That would be me. And the motion for your removal stands." The silence that followed was absolute. The empire had not just been challenged, it had been conquered, and its former queen could do nothing but stare into the face of the woman she had created from the ashes of her own cruelty. The silence that followed Amelia's declaration was a living thing, a dense, heavy presence that pressed down on everyone in the room. It was the sound of a dynasty ending. The shareholders, who moments before had been a sea of hostile, anxious faces, were now completely still, their gazes shifting from the pale, trembling form of Eleanor Vance to the calm, immovable figure of Amelia Reed. In that single, silent moment, allegiances were redrawn. These were people of capital, of power, and they recognized it instantly. They were witnessing a transfer of an empire, and they would not stand in the way of the new monarch. Mr. Chen, Amelia's lawyer, stepped forward into the void. His voice was the clean, sharp instrument that would perform the final, legal dissection. "The motion has been tabled," he announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. "A vote of no confidence in CEO Eleanor Vance. We will now proceed with the vote. All in favor?" A few of the minority shareholders, sensing the seismic shift, raised their hands with a quiet aye. Mr. Chen made a note. "And the shares represented by North Star Holdings and its associated funds?" He looked pointedly at Amelia. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. 51.02% of all shares vote. "Aye," Mr. Chen declared. "The motion carries. Effective immediately, Eleanor Vance is removed as CEO and as a member of the board of directors." He then repeated the process for Mark, stripping him of his title and board seat with the same brutal efficiency. A gavel, which had seemed like a ceremonial prop just moments before, sounded on the polished table. The sound was as final as a coffin nail being hammered into place. Security guards, briefed by Mr. Chen beforehand, moved discreetly to flank Eleanor. Her face was a mask of apoplectic rage. She opened her mouth to speak, to scream, to protest, but no sound came out. She had spent a lifetime commanding rooms with her voice, and now it had abandoned her. She was simply escorted out, a queen being led from her own castle into exile. Amelia then walked to the head of the table, to the lectern that was still warm from Eleanor's grip. She looked out at the remaining board members and shareholders. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice calm and assured. "My name is Amelia Reed. For those of you who don't know me, I am the founder and CEO of Phoenix Designs. As of today, I will also be serving as the new CEO of this company." She did not speak of the past, of revenge, of betrayal. To do so would have been a sign of weakness. Instead, she spoke of the future. She laid out a brilliant, concise vision for revitalizing the company, a vision rooted in innovation, sustainability, and fiscal responsibility. She spoke of rebuilding the firm's creative core, of fostering talent, of creating a new culture. And then, with the precision of a surgeon, she delivered the quiet, killing blow. "Our greatest asset is our people," she said, her gaze sweeping the room, "and from this day forward, we will invest in them accordingly. We will be instituting a new, company-wide benefits program, which will include the most comprehensive parental leave policy in this industry. We will no longer be a company that sees family as a professional liability. We will be a company that champions it." The subtext was a cannon blast in the silent room. She continued, "Furthermore, I am commissioning a full, independent audit of employee compensation, treatment, and the pension funds that were restructured. Under previous leadership, this company will once again be a place of integrity, from the ground floor to this boardroom." She had not mentioned her own story once, yet she had told it completely. She had passed judgment on their entire reign, not with personal invective, but with professional policy. When the meeting was finally adjourned, the room emptied quickly, leaving only Amelia and Mark in the vast, silent space. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out, his expensive suit hanging on him like a costume. He approached her hesitantly, his hands outstretched. "Amelia," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, you have to listen to me." It was her. It was always her. She twisted everything. She pressured me. I was a coward. I know I was. But I never, ever stopped loving you. He took another step, his eyes pleading. "Think of Leo, our son. We can fix this. For him." Amelia listened to his entire desperate, pathetic speech without a single flicker of expression. She let the silence hang between them after he finished, letting him drown in it. When she finally spoke, her voice was not angry. It was something far worse. It was indifferent. The time to speak of love and family was in a different room. "Many years ago, Mark," she said, her voice quiet and clear. "You had your chance to use your voice, and you chose silence. That silence was your answer. This," she said, gesturing to the empty boardroom, "the fallen empire is mine." She then turned, her back straight and proud, and walked towards the great mahogany doors, not once looking back. She left him standing alone in the tomb of his family's legacy, a ghost in a kingdom he had helped to build and then allowed to be destroyed. Months passed. The chill of the old regime in Vance Tower thawed under a new Sunday. The dark, intimidating mahogany of the CEO's office had been replaced with light oak, glass, and living green walls. Where Eleanor's desk had been a throne of polished obsidian, Amelia's was a wide, welcoming drafting table, littered with the blueprints of a brighter, more innovative future. The company, which she had renamed Phoenix Vance, was not just solvent, it was thriving. The fear that had stalked the hallways was replaced by a vibrant, collaborative energy. She had not just taken over a company, she was resurrecting its soul. One afternoon, Mr. Harrison came to her office. He was not there for their usual strategic meeting. He carried a heavy, dust-covered box, which he placed on her table with a solemn reverence. During the archives consolidation, we found a hidden safe, walled up behind a bookcase in Charles Vance's original office, he explained, his voice low. There was no money inside, there was only this. He opened the box. Inside was a thick, leather-bound ledger and a series of rolled-up architectural drawings, yellowed with age. Amelia carefully unrolled the top blueprint. It was the original design for the company's first landmark building, the one that had launched the Vance name. The design was brilliant, a work of genius. But the signature in the bottom right-hand corner, written in a confident, artistic script, was not Charles Vance. It was Robert Reed, her father. Amelia looked up at Mr. Harrison, her heart pounding in her chest. A question formed in her eyes, a question she was almost too afraid to ask. Mr. Harrison simply pushed the old ledger towards her. She opened it. The pages were filled with her father's handwriting, detailing the original business plan, the financials, and the 50/50 partnership agreement between himself and Charles Vance. And then, in the final entries, came a growing sense of dread as her father detailed his suspicions that Charles was embezzling funds, followed by a note about his plan to confront him. The date of the final entry was the day before his fatal car accident. "Your father was the vision, Mr. Harrison said, his voice thick with an emotion held back for decades. He was the talent. Charles Vance was just the money and the name. After the accident, Charles produced a forged document stating your father had sold him his shares. I was just a junior accountant then. I knew it was a lie, but I was powerless. All I could do was make a promise, a vow to my best friend, that one day, somehow, I would see justice done." He finally looked her in the eye, his own gaze shining with unshed tears. "When you walked into that company, Amelia, so full of the same light, the same talent, I knew my promise had found its moment. Helping you was never about charity. It was about fulfilling a 40-year-old oath. It was about bringing the company back to its rightful heir." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Amelia stared at her father's signature, her mind reeling, connecting a lifetime of disparate dots. Her innate talent, her drive, the strange magnetic pull she had always felt towards this very company. Her entire life, her entire struggle, had not been a random series of tragic events. It had been a circle, a long, winding path of destiny leading her right back to this room, to this desk, to this legacy. Her personal, painful quest for revenge had been, all along, the unwitting instrument of a much grander, generational justice. She hadn't just been fighting for herself. She had been fighting for the father she never knew. At that moment, the door to the office opened, and Leo, now a bright-eyed 6-year-old, ran in, holding up a drawing of a spaceship. He ran into her arms, and she held him tightly, looking from her son's vibrant face to her father's faded signature. The past, the present, and the future, all held together in her arms. She realized then that the greatest justice was not the act of destruction, but the act of restoration. It wasn't about the pleasure of watching the Vances fall. It was about the profound peace of placing the company's future into the hands of its rightful heir, her son, the grandson of the man who had dreamed it all up in the first place. Her victory was not an ending. It was a beginning. Never underestimate the quiet of a person who has endured too much. The world is conditioned to fear the loud, the bombastic, the overt threat. But true, lasting change, true justice, is often forged in the crucible of a long and patient silence. For when a person who has been wronged finally decides to speak, their voice is not merely words, it is a verdict. And their actions are not just a response, they are a reckoning. Thank you for listening. Join us next time as we uncover another story hidden in the quiet heart of a family's darkest secrets.